in the chromosomes, and everybody has that. And every animal that you see out there has it, has DNA. Some viruses don't. They have RNA instead. But what we're going to discuss are two kinds of DNA. These are short, tandemly repeated letters of DNA. And you know there are 4 different kinds of bases or nucleotides in the DNA. There are A's and T's and C's and G's. And these microsatellites are tandemly repeated pieces of DNA, so the code comes up CA, 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 CA. And every one of us has got lots of those in our genomes. Of events, how we discovered how variable humans are in their genes. At first we didn't know about genes, and we just studied the shapes like skin color or hair color or height, or things that we didn't know really how they were inherited, although there were assumptions about how they were inherited, starting even before Darwin. Then blood groups, at the beginning of the 20th century, blood groups were identified, and that very quickly after the discovery of Mendel's rules, it was seen that they were behaving like genes. Although there were bad mistakes, like the ABO system, that was for 20 years, people thought it was one gene, thought it was 2 genes, and it turned out to be just one. That caused a lot of trouble in paternity suits, by the way. The next thing, in the 1960s, 2 scholars, Lewinton and Hubby, and a third one in England named Harry Harris, discovered that you could tell proteins one from another by the electric charge that they had on that molecule and how far the molecule would move in a charged field. And that revealed a very, very important phenomenon that almost every animal and human on the planet had lots more variation than we thought before. So that led to a lot of changes in how people viewed evolution of humans, for instance. And starting around 2000, you started to be able to get single nucleotide polymorphism at a large scale. So today, for instance, we can relatively quickly find millions of those in a sample of humans. And today it would cost a few $100s. 20 years ago, it cost many tens of thousands of dollars. The machines weren't like the ones we have today. That's been one of the huge advances in technology, to be able to detect the variations between A's and C's cheaply. 2 examples of how colonial culture had an effect on the genes of people that we may not be too familiar with. Australian Aborigines, Y chromosome. Remember, that's the part that's only passed down from male to male. 70% of the Y chromosomes in the Aboriginal databases are British. So this, we're starting to know what the culture of colonization actually percent in this Andean population. 94% of the Y chromosomes are European. So if we want to study genetic variation today, even in indigenous peoples, we have to know something about how those peoples today represent what happened even 100 years ago. This is a picture of fractions of consanguineous marriages, cousin marriages, double cousin, first cousin marriages, other cousin marriages, consanguineous marriages they're called, from the word for blood, sanguine here. And you can see that 50% of marriages in this part of the world are between relatives. It's a bit hard to see, but every one of these is a person, a dot, and it tells you how much of the DNA, how many pieces of the DNA you can string together without finding a single variant. And these pieces are all more than 5 million pieces along, more than 5 million. Now, over here, this is all of the Middle East, and you just saw where those people were. That's from here, those people. Over here is Africa and then there's Europe. This is Asia, China, Japan. But over here, you see these high values here. They're American indigenous people. That's there not because they inbred, but because the founders of that population were a relatively small number of humans. And if you have a relatively small number, then you don't have to have culture to inbreed. You're going to be inbreeding automatically, because everybody, I'll show you some more on this, but the indigenous American community has a lot of that homozygosity, not because they choose to marry cousins, but everybody has very little limited variation, very limited variation. In the Bible, there's a story about a good Samaritan. Everybody has heard of that. So there's even a law called the Good Samaritan Law. The Samaritans today live in two communities in Israel. One is in downtown Tel Aviv, a suburb called Holon, and the other near Nazareth, in a place called Shechem in Hebrew. There are about 500 in each of those two communities. And it's been a puzzle for a long time who the Samaritans were. They know who they were, and they're very sure about it. And we'll discuss who they were. This is a picture at the Festival of Tabernacles, which in Hebrew is Sukkot. And this is the high priest of the Samaritans. They call him a Cohen, as well as the Jewish people call their high priest Cohens. And the people that we know as Samaritans, they claim to be the descendants of Joseph's two sons, called Ephraim and Manasseh. In the Old Testament, you can read about Ephraim and Manasseh. The Samaritans claim that they have been there since before the Babylonian exile. And the Babylonian exile, which is when the Assyrian king, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, conquered the kingdom of Israel and Judah in 586 BC and exported all of the known Jews that he could get hold of, known colorblind. Very rare you find two, except in populations that have high inbreeding. And the Samaritans are the most highly inbred population on the planet. They routinely marry first cousins, and those cousins are in 4 lineages. There are 4 family names among the Samaritans. So they're marrying over this period of 2,700 years. They've been marrying within the families for a very long time. And that explains why you see this kind of inbreeding, very highly inbred, who came from up here in the Assyrian Empire. He was quite a big deal. You can see how much land he covered into Egypt. And this is what he wrote. So you can all read this. This is called the Nimrud Prism. There were 2 such stones in which he describes what he did. He says, the inhabitants of Samaria and Samarina, who plotted with the enemy, he fought against them, and he took 27,280 people and settled them in the middle of Assyria, and he brought into the population the rest of them from other places. The other places were Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. So that's his claim. He counted them as Assyria. Cohen's taken off the street in Israel, any old Cohen. You can take them off the street in New York if you want to, too. The Cohens are presumably the descendants of the high priests. They're treated differently in Jewish liturgy also. And then we have Yemeni Jews, Iraqi, Ashkenazi, Moroccan, we have Bedouins. These are all samples taken from the Israel Genome Project. Libyan Jews, it's a small community that dates back to Alexander the Great. The Druze population, who are in the news a lot now, they're up on the Syrian border and also just near Haifa, and Ethiopian Jews who came to Israel only in the last 40, 50 years. And then, of course, there are Palestinians. Now, if you look at these numbers here, whether you use this statistic or this statistic, the closest people to the Samaritans are the Cohens. That was a huge surprise to everybody when we discovered this. How could they be so close to the most Jewish people if they aren't being recognized by the Israeli government as Jewish? They are recognized as Israelites, but not Jewish. And their liturgy accepts as the holy books, the 5 books of Moses, called the Torah, but they don't accept the prophets, and they don't accept that that's the book called Nevi'im in Hebrew, or nor do they accept the Ketuvim, the writings, the books of Kings and Proverbs and all that stuff. They don't, that's not part of their law. And they speak Aramaic. That's their language, Aramaic, the ancient form of Hebrew. So it seems to me that things happened around the return from the Babylonian exile in 586, when these people who were there had been there since 722 or even before, under the rule of the Assyrians. Something must have happened. And according to their history, when you talk to them, when the people returned from the exile, they decided they wanted to build a temple in Jerusalem, the second temple, the one that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And the second temple was the one that was destroyed in 70 by the Romans. And they came to the leaders of the returning Jewish people, namely Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, people like that who are in the Bible. And they told them, you're building the temple in the wrong place. Jerusalem's not where it should be. It should be up here in Mount Gerizim, in the north of that. So the temple was built in Jerusalem. But these Samaritans have very close relationships genetically to today's Jewish people from that area, either from the Cohens or the Yemeni Jews or the Iraqi Jews. They're much closer than they are to the Palestinians or the Bedouins. So we were very confused when we saw this. So we went to the head of Jewish studies at Stanford and we asked him what's going on. But he caved and surrendered at the cost of a lot of Jewish lives during the wars, the Roman wars that led to the destruction of the temple. But he converted and became a journalist. And Josephus, his writings tell us where the great antiquities are, like Masada and the palaces of Herod. He wrote all this stuff down, and we know that because it's in his writings. And he lived in this period. We don't know when he died, but probably during the time that the temple was destroyed, which is 70 or 70. And he said that he was writing about this period. Now, he's got to be using hearsay too. And he says that the leader of the Persians in Samaria is where the Samaritans live. That's the northern kingdom today, claimed by many of the West Bank settlers to be part of Israel. So he said Sanballides gave his daughter, and many priests and Israelites were involved in marriages, and they deserted to Manasseh, and many of the high priests went over to marry relatives there of the leader of the Assyrians, and they became the descendants, the antecedents of the Y chromosome people, because it's only the men going over. So he said maybe this is why we have the Y chromosomes that look as though they came from high priests, because many of the high priests defected. It's an idea. we can't prove that one way. This is a map that Cavalli and I made of the what we call the Great Migrations, how we got to where we are today on a worldwide basis. About 60 to 100,000 years ago, and possibly even 120,000. Other people have put little more accurate calculations since we made this map. In the last 5 years, there's been other maps. And this is how people went out of Africa. This is what we call out of Africa 2. Out of Africa 1 is Neanderthal, and the people before 500,000 years ago. We're talking here about movement up here, and some of our calculations suggest that all of these Africans here today are really descended from the Bushmen, from the Khoisan-speaking Bushmen. Everybody been to Namibia, South Africa? You hear the Cook-speaking people. That's these people who could possibly have been the ancestors. But then we come across here into the Americas, and we see at about 15, could be up to 20, but about 15,000 before now, the indigenous American populations are formed and come through here. At about 40 to 45, the Australian Aborigines are here, coming this way. We don't know how they got there, but probably they came across land bridges there. And the most recent thing that I've been working on is this area here, the Pacific. And that's an interesting area because we now have very good evidence that the Pacific islands started to be colonized, including Micronesia and Melanesia, at about 3,000 to 5,000 before now, which is not very long ago. And that people arrived, today's indigenous Hawaiians are descended from people who arrived between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago. We're still working on that. Now, what is the only quantitative thing I'm going to show you? If you have a sample that has lots of reds and greens and blues and yellows, and you take a sample of that, which is a small sample, say 500 people moving into across the Red Sea, then it's going to be less variable. It has to be less variable. It's a very simple experiment to do. And then when that sample starts to move around, the sample of its sample is going to be less variable too. And finally, when you get to the Americas, you're going to have the smallest amount of variation. And that explains why we saw what we did about the dots with the American Indians having indigenous Americans having such a high homozygosity. Remember the Human Genome Project, which got $3 billion. We suggested that for a little bit more, you could study all the humans instead of just a couple of Americans. And we could get samples from all around the world and ask, how did the human population of today, how was it formed originally? Just by looking if we had enough DNA. The government said that $25 million was way out of their budget. So they just continued with the $3 billion for the Human Genome Project. But we did manage to get 53 worldwide samples. And we didn't collect them. They were in collections that anthropologists had made over the past 25, 30 years. And when you look at that DNA, what you see is a graph like this. Now this is very statistical, but this is a graph of 1,000 vertical lines where the color indicates the ancestry of the person that we're dealing with. So this is a graph of 1,000 people. Every person is a line, and it tells you how much of their ancestry is red. That's all Africans. Those populations are all Africans. These populations are all indigenous Americans. These populations are Melanesian. These populations here are all Asian, Chinese, different minority groups from China, like the Han and the Daoer and the Orochen and the Dai and the Yi, all of those interesting minority nations from China. You have samples from all of them. And this is Pakistan. This because of their different religions and their beliefs. And each time they'll be taking some of the ancestry from that country. And that's why they have ancestries in 3 places. These people don't have ancestries in 3, although the Pima do. The Pima have a little bit of ancestry from other places. But look, these two here are among the most interesting populations on the planet. You're all familiar with the Hazara from the Kite Runner. You all remember the book called The Kite Runner, the movie called The Kite Runner? That's the story of the Hazara. Hazaras are in Afghanistan and some in Pakistan, and they have ancestry in Europe, in Pakistan and in China. And they were part of the great Yuan dynasty when Genghis Khan captured all of that part of the world. And one of the things Genghis Khan's people did is leave their genes around. This is Europe, Pakistan, and China. That's the Uyghurs. The Uyghur people who are under such tremendous pressure in Xinjiang province in China now. The government is trying to eliminate their culture. They're Muslim people, and they believe that they should be part of Greater Turkmenistan. Their language is part of Turkish. Their indigenous language is partly Turkish. So this tells you, a graph like this tells you a huge amount about the history of colonization and movement of people through the world. This is Rapa Nui, Easter Island. Easter Island seems to have an awful lot of European, but up here, Central Native American. About 10 to 15% of the ancestry on Easter Island appears to be coming from South America, just like Flora Iredell said should happen when the migration from there in those great canoes would go across the Pacific. It's Galton, who was the coiner of the term eugenics, and is the second highest IQ posthumously estimated in history. He was a cousin of Darwin, and he says, if we estimate the moral nature of America, this was in 1865, published in Macmillan's, which is the predecessor of what's called Nature now. If we estimate the moral nature of Americans from their present social state, we shall find it to be just what we might have expected from such a parentage. They're enterprising, defiant, and touchy, impatient of authority, furious politicians, very tolerant of fraud and violence, possessing much high and generous spirit and some true religious feeling, but strongly addicted to cant. That's that view of inheritance which lasted until the Second World War, and by the way, which Stanford University had an unfortunate influence on with the Human Betterment Foundation and the promulgation of the notions of eugenics. Moses Maimonides, the great rabbi and physician from the 12th century, and he wrote this in Spain under the Moors, and he says, it's impossible for a man to be endowed by nature from his very birth with either virtue or vice, just as it is impossible that he should be born skilled by nature in any particular art. It is possible, however, that through natural causes he may be from... I have entered into this subject, so thou mayest not believe the absurd ideas of astrologers who falsely assert that the constellation at the time of one's birth determines whether one is to be virtuous or vicious. I think that's a perfect summary of the way in which geneticists think about phenotypes and behavior today. And it's only 1,000 years old.